Okay, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Steve Sapienza. I'm part of the editorial team at the Pulitzer Center. As we wait for a few more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're watching and listening in from. We'd love to know that. I'm very thrilled today to be moderating this conversation about the film Entangled by David Abel and Andy Laub in conjunction with this screening. This event is a co-presentation with the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital as part of its fall showcase. It's going on now through Wednesday. And if you've not yet seen Entangled, please follow the instructions in your event registration to view this really great film after the discussion. The Pulitzer Center is proudly partnered with the DC Environmental Film Festival for the past 10 years to showcase powerful, underreported environmental stories, and we're excited to share and discuss this film with everyone here today. Entangled is part of a larger Pulitzer Center Connected Coastlines reporting project that chronicles the controversy around efforts to save the North Atlantic right whales from extinction. Fewer than 400 of these amazing sea mammals remain, making the whales among the planet's most endangered species. And yet their unfolding struggle rarely makes headlines. So today, we'll engage in conversation with you and a range of stakeholders about efforts to save the North Atlantic right whale. And thank you for joining us. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Pulitzer Center, we're a nonprofit journalism and education organization. We're based in Washington, DC. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year on global and local issues. And a good many of these stories that we support focus on the environment. We have a multi-year rainforest journalism initiative that supports reporting by journalists in the Amazon basin, the Congo basin, and Southeast Asia. And we're very proud to announce a major new initiative, the Rainforest Investigations Network. This is a one-year journalism fellowship that will harness investigative reporting and international collaboration to tackle deforestation, corruption, and governance. On our education side, we have many initiatives that include a very strong university program that connects journalists with college students and faculty in person and now virtually. That program also includes reporting fellowships awarded to students from our partners at more than 35 campuses. And on the K through 12 education front, we reach thousands of students and educators by class visits, online sessions, and professional development workshops. And we also organize public and virtual events like this one. You can find all of our reporting and educational resources on our website at pulitzercenter.org. Now, just for a few logistics before we begin, we'll start the conversation with our guests, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. Feel free to begin adding your questions to the chat on your screen at any time throughout the remarks, and do so as soon as something comes to mind. We want to let you know that we are recording this session, and we will post it online for others who could not join us today. So now I'd like to introduce our guests for today. David Abel is an award-winning reporter who covers fisheries and environmental issues for the Boston Globe and director of the film Entangled. Representative Seth Moulton is a U.S. Representative for Massachusetts 6th Congressional District. He is a former Marine Corps officer and a member of the Democratic Party. Dr. Moira Brown is a senior scientist with the Canadian Whale Institute, Campobello Whale Rescue Team, and scientist emeritus at the New England Aquarium. Peter Baker is the director of Northern Oceans Conservation at the Pew Charitable Trusts and lives on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'd like to start things off by congratulating David and Andy Laub on this incredibly moving and timely film. For those of you who may not know, the film recently won a Jackson Wild Award, which is known as the Oscars of nature films. And, you know, David, I'd like to just ask you what motivated you both to make this film and why now?
Well, thank you so much, Steve. And thank you so much to the Pulitzer Center for all your support. It was crucial to make this film come to be. And thank you very much to the DC Environmental Film Festival, which has been a wonderful supporter of our films in the past. So we only wish we could all be together in person to share this film. but this is a good substitute. So, and I just want to extend my thanks to Peter, Seth, and Moira for being here and for taking part in this. It's really nice to have such expertise to share with an audience. To answer your question, there are a number of things that brought us to this film, but I just highlight one of them. A little more than a year ago, when we just started thinking about making this film, the United Nations released this report that found that estimated about 1 million species are likely to go extinct by the end of this century. And I wrote a story about that for the paper, for the Boston Globe, where I work as an environment reporter, as you mentioned. And I just had trouble wrapping my head around this incredibly large statistic. How do you even begin to conceive of something about a loss of biodiversity like that? And so I started to think, how do you tell that story? And I thought, maybe you tell the story through one species, through one particularly iconic species. And I'd been writing for the paper quite a bit about this issue, about the loss of North Atlantic right whales. And I learned about it through my last film called Lobster War, which was all about how climate change is affecting our oceans, particularly the Gulf of Maine, which is warming apparently faster than almost any other body of water on the planet. And it just seemed like this was the right time to tell this story. There was an effort to try to reduce mortality through the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team, and that offered a narrative arc for us to try to chart the film with. But in short, this film is about our loss of biodiversity, how climate change is fueling that, and what are all the challenges that go along with trying to figure out how to stop that loss of biodiversity and how to balance efforts to try to reduce that biodiversity with all kinds of other stakeholders. And in this case, the nation's most valuable fishery, the lobster industry. And so for all of those reasons, we thought this would be a compelling way to try to address that really difficult subject.
And can you talk a little bit about the challenge? I mean, if it was a challenge, but you and Andy did such a great job of getting so many different perspectives, valuable insights from different stakeholders here who have really strong historical and vested interests in the issue of saving the whale, but also the lobster fishery. How did you navigate that? How were you able to get people to talk?
Well, I mean, I would say as a journalist and a filmmaker, it's not always easy to get people to talk. You knock on doors, and sometimes people just don't open it or choose not to talk to you. With this film, I would say we had a very different experience, and we were really fortunate. I think we probably interviewed more than 100 people for the film, and we were incredibly pleased that so many people were willing to talk to us, to open their doors and share their point of view. That wasn't universal. There were some folks who did not talk to us. But then again, there were other people. There were so many people who did talk to us. We couldn't, fit everyone into the film, unfortunately. But I should say that we were incredibly lucky to have so many people willing to share their stories and speak from the heart.
And that they did. I was really, really impressed. For me, seeing and hearing the perspectives of the lobster fishermen was just really, really poignant and effective. And I appreciated that as a viewer. Congressman Moulton, you're born and raised in Massachusetts, went to school there, and now you represent people from the 6th Congressional District, which is a coastal region in northeastern Mass. As the film shows, it's a very complex issue given all the stakeholders involved. What has been your approach to navigating this difficult balance of protecting an endangered species while respecting the positions of fishermen, scientists, and environmentalists?
I was first elected just a few years ago, and one of the first things I was told as the representative of this district is you have to choose, Seth. Are you going to be with the environmentalists or with the fishermen? Black and white. And you could then, they listed it off, this senator is with the fishermen, this senator is with the environmentalists. They've chosen, right? And past representatives have chosen as well. I said, I don't believe in that dichotomy. I said, fundamentally, both the fishermen and the environmentalists want the same thing, which is a sustainable fishery. I mean, you can't keep fishing if you don't have a sustainable fishery. And obviously that's what the environmentalists are after. And so what we really need to do is rally around the science. Just rally around the science and get to the point where we have science that's trustworthy enough that we can all believe it. Now, when it comes to fishing regulation, that's obviously not the case right now. I mean, the fishermen follow the NOAA regulations, and yet the NOAA regulations are all over the map because one year they seem to be doing just fine, and the next year fish populations, as measured, fall off the cliff. And so when it came to the case of the right whale, we took the same approach. We said, let's focus on the science. Let's come up with innovative solutions that people that people can agree will make a real difference here. And let's get everybody to the table. When I first started just in fishing issues in general, we brought together a new task force specifically focused on cod, since that's kind of the iconic fish of the area. And it was really the first time, and as long as anyone can remember, that representatives of the fishing community sat down with representatives of the environmental and scientific communities and just said, how can we improve the science? How can we get to where we need to be? When we designed the Save the Right Whales Act, which is the piece of legislation that I've been pushing and funding, and I can discuss in more detail later, we took that same approach. We brought everybody to the table and said, how can we all together come up with innovative solutions based in science that will make a difference?
And I think the film really kind of captures that movement and really kind of bringing people together the way you describe it there.
Especially in Massachusetts, that's absolutely right. I mean, the story of the Massachusetts lobstermen and how they're willing to come to the table and take part in these discussions is exactly the kind of cooperation that we've been fostering. I mean, it's unfortunate that that Maine has not done the same. And obviously their congressional delegation has not been willing to participate in such a beneficial way.
See, I'd like to remind people, if you have questions for the panelists, please do put them in the chat, and we will, in the Q&A, and we will pose those questions. Peter Baker of Pew Charitable Trusts, this past summer, you and your organization petitioned the U.S. Commerce Department, urging them to take swift action to save the right whale. What steps were you seeking from the Commerce Department, and what has been the response so far?
So back in June, we did a formal petition to the Secretary of Commerce asking for emergency action to create seasonal closures in the lobster fishery to using vertical lines. So it wouldn't shut down lobster fishing, it would shut down lobster fishing with vertical lines so that at some point, if there was ropeless fishing, it could be allowed in the closed areas. But the time area closures that we seek would be a small time area closure around Mount Desert Rock off of Mount Desert Island in the fall for a few months, late summer and fall. There's a seasonal closure in the inshore Gulf of Maine, several miles out to sea from where Congressman Moulton lives, that would be a 3-month spring closure. We proposed a permanent closure, meaning a year-round closure beneath Martha's Vineyard and the islands where right whales have been seen to congregate, and this would overlap with an area that the state of Massachusetts has proposed for closure. And then finally, a larger offshore closure in the spring and early summer that would allow right whales to transit from the Cape Cod Bay closure into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or at least up to the Canadian border while they're leaving Massachusetts Cape Cod Bay and transiting up to Canada. And the reason that we've done that is because closures are an effective measure that can be put in place fairly immediately. A lot of the measures that right now are being considered to protect whales revolve around wide-scale gear changes. So every fisherman, all 5,000 lobstermen in New England would have to change their gear, change their rope, trawl up, meaning instead of having one line for each trap, having one line for multiple traps. These are innovative ideas that have a lot of merit, but these ideas take years to explore, years to implement. They require manufacturing of a whole new gear, whereas closed areas are a widespread, widely available, widely used solution in fisheries up and down the East Coast. There's closed areas in the groundfish fishery, in the herring fishery. The Massachusetts lobster fishery has a closed area in Cape Cod Bay. In Canada, there's closures. The fisheries don't operate year round. The idea that our fisheries would be 12-month fisheries with no closures is really an anomaly. Most fisheries on the East Coast have seasons. So for instance, in the Bay of Fundy, lobstermen fish 3 to 6 months out of the year. They don't fish 3 to 9 months out of, or 6 to 9 months out of the year. Same with the crab fishery in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And most of the fisheries, for instance, the black sea bass fishery, it's a seasonal fishery or else it's quota limited. So from our point of view, the best way to immediately put measures in place that can immediately protect right whales is to have closures that are targeted, that are seasonal, that don't impact the entire fleet, but really get you the most bang for your buck and can be put in place right now.
Thank you for that, Peter. Maybe this is a question for David or the congressman. With regard to asking fishermen to change gear, to endure closures, David, and you're talking with them, what are their main reservations? And Congressman, are there any potential solutions to help them overcome these reservations?
Well, I'll just say briefly, and Mo probably could speak about this more eloquently than anyone, perhaps. But there are all kinds of concerns. First of all, this technology of ropeless fishing is new, and it's advancing, and there are all kinds of manifestations of it. But new technology for a group of people who have been fishing the same way, more or less, for generations is not an easy ask. And also, most importantly, the new technology as it stands right now is expensive. And without some form of financial assistance to help the industry transition from rope using vertical buoy line, which again is the main conflict or the main source of mortality for North Atlantic right whales. And these are, again, the lines that go from the surface to the sea floor. And there are millions of them that are in the Gulf of Maine through over the course of the year. Transitioning to a fishery that does not use that kind of system to raise the traps is expensive right now. And maybe the congressman can talk about how the Save the Right Whale Act might help with that expense, and what the future might hold in terms of potential subsidies. And we subsidize our farmers, soybean farmers, all kinds of there are all kinds of agricultural supports, and seafood and lobster are huge parts of the food supply. And finding a way to help this vital industry, this iconic industry here in New England, make and in Canada, make that transition is important and would require some federal assistance, I would think.
I mean, that's right, David. And let me just make a few comments on this. First of all, lobstermen are not living in waterfront mansions, okay? They're just barely scraping by. So the issue is not just that it costs a little bit more money, but that this additional cost could literally put them out of business. Now, David talked about subsidies, and he's right. There are lots of subsidies for all sorts of other kinds of farmers who incidentally make much less healthy foods than the sort of farmers of the sea here. We do well as Americans when we eat seafood, but it's also important to understand that we do well when we eat seafood that comes from well-regulated fisheries. The bottom line is Americans are going to eat fish, whether it comes from Gloucester or it comes from a fishery off of China. But at least the fisheries here are regulated, whereas many of the ones far overseas are not at all. So there's an environmental component to this too. And some environmentalists are all about just closing down fisheries. They don't realize Americans are going to keep buying fish. They're just going to divert their purchases to fisheries that are not well regulated. So while I'm not in general a fan of huge subsidies for anyone, I mean, that subsidies usually indicate some sort of market failure, they really make sense for a lot of reasons in this environment. And so it's something that we absolutely have to explore and put on the table in the long term. And I can tell you that I have been advocating for relief for fishermen just as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as the farmers across the country have been receiving relief as well. Incidentally, the fishermen also deserve relief because of President Trump's trade war, which significantly impacted their bottom line. He, again, provided billions and billions of dollars of relief to the farmers who were hurt by his trade war, but did not offer hardly anything to the fishermen. So it's a very appropriate analogy. Where the Save the Right Whales Act comes in is we established a grant program so that different people with a legitimate stake in the industry can develop innovative solutions with our grant money, and ultimately pursue solutions, find technologies that will be acceptable to the fishermen, that will be economically reasonable as an investment, and will be effective at the main goal here, which obviously is to reduce entanglements with the right whales. So we're trying to take in a sense, a very innovative, entrepreneurial, free market approach to this, rather than just saying, hey, big government agency, come out with some new regulations or spend 20 years developing some new gear. We're offering a competitive grant program for stakeholders, both in the industry and in the private sector and in academia, to come up with the most innovative solutions that we can find. Does that answer your question, David? David kind of posed some questions to me. Does that cover it?
I think so. Yes. Thank you.
So, Dr. Brown, you're joining us from Canada, and I'm hoping you can give us a Canadian perspective on this issue. What do you see as sort of, first of all, how do you view efforts to protect the right whale in the U.S. and Canada, and what are the key differences in these efforts that you see between the two countries in protecting the whales?
Well, thanks, Steve. First of all, I'd like to thank David and Andy for making a really thorough documentary on this problem. You provided the details on the complexity of this, both in terms of the fishermen, the social economic issues related to the coastal communities, as well as the science side. People have talked about balance, and we do need to find a balance in order to not lose the economic value of these fisheries products to those local communities while we're trying to protect right whales. And very much so, and Peter emphasized this, the increasing urgency to do something soon. So I lived in the States for 20 years in the 1990s and 2000s up until 2016. And so I saw a lot of the measures that were being put in place in the US. And yes, David, you're right. The fisheries in Canada are seasonal. For example, the lobster fishery in the Bay of Fundy just started on Tuesday this week, and it goes through the winter. So it's a winter fishery. Not the same for the snow crab up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, however. So we're faced with a problem where there's been a huge habitat shift in North Atlantic right whales from the Gulf of Maine in the late spring, summer, and fall. Almost half of the population is now in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and there's just a complete overlap with the snow crab fishery there. And this started in about 2015, perhaps a little sooner, but the animals, the research has shown that the animals are there from late April till mid-November, which is a very long period of time, and overlapping with the snow crab fishery, which is fished as soon as the ice melts in April, and goes until the end of June. So what Canada has done as a direct result of the problem with entanglement of right whales in snow crab gear, I mean, these guys really want to solve the problem. And the Canadian government has used an adaptive program where as soon as right whales are seen, closures take place. And so if a right whale is seen within a grid, and these grids are 10 minutes of latitude by 10 minutes of longitude, that grid is closed and 8 grids around. And that'll stay closed for 15 days, except if there's an additional time period where there's a right whale seen close to the initial sighting, then it's closed until November 15th. And so vast areas are getting closed. And this is a hardship for the snow crab fishermen because they're having to move their gear. So they have to move their gear out of the area. The program that Fisheries and Oceans is using, which is the counterpart to NOAA Fisheries in Canada, is that these closures are really focused towards the snow crab fishery, but they do occur in other areas. So if right whales are seen in some of the other habitats they used to frequent in the Bay of Fundy and south of Nova Scotia, that can also result in closures. What they did do this summer as well, after adapting these closures every year as we learn more about right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, they did issue an experimental permit this year for fishermen to fish for 2 weeks in June in a closed area with ropeless gear. And they caught snow crab, and those snow crab went to market with ropeless. So that is really, that's a huge step. And I think some of the gear that's being used in Massachusetts waters as well they're using hybrid systems, and that product is making it to market. So we are making grounds. We just don't have the luxury of time anymore. Right whales have been in a declining population now for 10 years. Part of it's climate change, shifting habitats. Part of it is low reproduction that's probably a result of climate change and shifting habitats and more stress on the females. So we don't have time anymore. We need to solve this problem soon. And I'm very encouraged, David, your film showed it, and conversations on the dock show it as well. There are more and more fishermen that realize they need to think differently about their fishery. The population, the consumer wants to buy a sustainable product. And they need to change their fishing practices in order to provide what the consumer is looking for. And I think those are all good things that are going to motivate this change. We just need to do it as fast as we can if we're going to keep the right whale around.
And I just want to underscore one thing that Mo was just saying. Just in the last few weeks, we learned that the actual number of right whales is significantly less than we thought just a year ago. So scientists in the last few weeks, as part of something called the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, estimated that there are only about 356 right whales remaining. That's down from their estimate a year before of 411, which is a 13% decline in the course of a year, just in their estimate. And we obviously can't say for sure how many really are remaining, but we also know that there are roughly about 85 breeding females left. And even more dramatic and concerning is that since 2017, only 68 females have given birth, suggesting the possibility that the number of breeding females could possibly be less than 85. And once we lose breeding females, the North Atlantic right whale will go the way of the vaquita, which is functional extinction.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, and maybe could be for Dr. Brown or Peter. Do we have other success stories for species restoration that we can use as models for our efforts to protect the right whales?
Well, there are there's some terrific recovery stories with humpbacks and gray whales, but those populations were not as reduced as North Atlantic right whales from hunting. There's some good success stories in the bird world with eagles and peregrine falcons. So there are success stories in the world, and quite frankly, we know what to do to change the trajectory of the population numbers of North Atlantic right whales, and that's to stop killing them. And the work that was published most recently, looking at all of the whales on which they have been necropsies conducted. So it's an animal autopsy. These animals don't get to die of old age. They don't get sick. They get hit by boats and they get entangled in fishing gear. So if we can stop those two things from occurring, this population has already demonstrated that it can recover. Back in 1990, there were, a couple hundred right whales. They've demonstrated a 2.5% population increase for 20 years. If we can stop our activities that affect these animals, and it's not just the lethal effects of entanglement and mortality and ship strikes, it's also the sublethal effects. And by that, I mean, as an example, a female right whale, and it's similar for humpbacks as well. If she gets entangled and she had a series of calves, let's say before she got entangled, it takes her a while to recover from that entanglement before she starts having calves again. So that would be like a sublethal effect. We haven't even begun to look at that in males yet. So yeah, I think the path forward is really clear, and we need to do it yesterday.
I think there is a lot of reason for hope. Fishermen are incredibly innovative. Before I went to work for Pew Charitable Trusts, I worked for a commercial fishing group on Cape Cod for 5 years. While I was there, we did a lot of cooperative research. We tagged cod to see their movement. We did studies where we would cage cod to see at what depths they could survive after being caught once they were released, to see if undersized fish were caught, if they could swim away and live to be caught another day. Fishermen are incredibly innovative about how they apply their gear. Fishermen in the groundfish fishery in New England have a long history of figuring out how to catch fish like pollock and haddock while avoiding cod when cod are depleted, and vice versa. What it really takes is will and capital, right? So there needs to be the political will to go out and develop a new way of fishing that can coincide with right whales, can allow right whales to thrive and the fishery to thrive. There needs to be a funding source, and that's why we look to people like Congressman Moulton to lead the way with things like the Save the Right Whale Act, to do the research and get the dollars out to the researchers so they can figure out a way that we can fish alongside right whales and have healthy populations. And currently, right now, all over the world, in Scotland, in Australia, in British Columbia, in the US West Coast in the Dungeness crab fishery, in the US South in the sea bass fishery, right here in Massachusetts in Cape Cod Bay, people are actively testing ropeless gear. Manufacturers are working with fishermen. They're figuring out how they can deploy the gear. And as Dr. Brown said, up in Atlantic Canada, snow crab fishermen are using the gear in commercial fisheries and selling the catch they make, and see that as potentially a future way forward. So like I'm saying, what we really need is the political will to change the fishery so it can coincide. We need fishermen to buy into it, and we need a funding source, a public funding source that will allow us to transition the fishing fleet from gear that isn't compatible with a healthy whale population to one that is. And I think we're at the beginning of that, and we need to get to a tipping point so that's where the future leads.
Got it. Another question. This is for Congressman Moulton or David. One of our viewers asked, any lessons from the film about other climate science issues, such as the development of aquaculture and offshore wind, which I know are also big questions up in that area in New England?
Maybe I'll just give a quick general answer, and then David can get into the specifics. In so many ways, this story is a story fundamentally about climate change. And it's striking when you hear Moira talk about how the population actually recovered, was on an increase for 20 years, and now has suddenly turned around. The reality is that we have a tougher job restoring the right whale population than we did 20 years ago because of climate change, because it's throwing so many things off kilter. Lobster populations are shifting. The whole fishery basically is shifting. That means that even techniques, including specific closure areas or diverting ships that might have worked 20 years ago, are not going to have the same effect today. And all of it is going to be a lot more difficult. So I think it's just important to make sure we stay grounded in that fact. I know it's not a revelation to anyone listening here, but it's really important to stay grounded in that fact. Obviously, we're not going to be effective at reversing climate change in time to save the right whale population. And that's an important fact to sink in too. I'm with everyone who wants to act as quickly as we can on climate change, but let's also be realistic. That alone is not going to save right whales. So we have to be doing the things that we're doing to reduce to reduce immediate impact, recognizing that it's going to be more difficult because of climate change, while also taking a long-term view on the absolute urgency of addressing climate change as a whole. But I'll turn it over to David for some more specifics.
I would just say thank you. I fully agree with what the Congressman just said. I mean, climate change has scrambled so much of our fisheries, especially in the Gulf of Maine. As Congressman noted, cod, for example, has had its own struggles that you could pin the problems on for climate change. I mean, we've seen something like a 90% decline in the population of cod in our region, which was the species that made New England thrive for generations. I would just say, on a note of hope, as Mo noted, we have seen since the 1980s a rise in the population of right whales. When it was thought after commercial whaling that the right whale, the North Atlantic right whale, might actually be extinct. And then at some point, I think in the 50s, they were rediscovered. And then by the 80s, there was an effort led in many ways by Mo's team at the New England Aquarium to try to take a census of the whales and try to protect the whales and lead efforts to create protections for them. And so I think in the early 80s, they were estimated to be roughly about 300. And I mean, the census for that time is very different than the way we actually count them now, which is far more sophisticated and rigorous. But we've seen through a variety of protections, specifically for regulations regarding shipping and the creation of shipping lanes and awareness about how large vessels traveling at high speeds could kill right whales, and regulations to require them to operate in specific lanes and to reduce their speeds when the whales are present, really helped increase allow the population to increase. And by 2010, the population had increased to something like 480 whales. And it was in many ways viewed as a success story. And we've seen in previous years, early in the 2000s, as many as 30 right whales or more born each year. So we know this population can thrive under the right conditions. But since 2010, we have seen a 25% or higher decline in the population. That rapid decline is frightening, and we aren't reproducing whales at a fast enough rate. In 2018, for the first time in anyone's memory, there were 0 calves born, which was a really big blow to the species. This past breeding season, there were 10 right whales born, which was better than the previous year when 7 were born. So that was seen as somewhat of a sign of success. However, sadly, 2 of those calves were killed. One of them was believed to be killed by a ship strike in the calving grounds hours after it was born. And as we note at the end of the film, despite those births, we need at this point something like 3 times that, or roughly about 30 whales to be born to keep this population sustainable.
There's some, I also looked at this film and felt kind of hopeful because of all the ways that the stakeholders were trying. They were really trying to, and are trying to figure this out. And Peter, I'm just sort of wondering, sort of picking up on the question from our audience, are there lessons that can be learned from this ongoing effort? to save the right whale that could be applied to other controversial issues, in the Gulf of Maine, like the development of aquaculture and offshore wind.
Well, I think the hope is that through this process that there's more trust built between fishermen, gear manufacturers, scientists, conservationists, and regulators to move forward. We've seen when those groups come together that change can be made pretty quickly and pretty rapidly, that we can put together regulations that can really protect resources, rebuild fisheries, rebuild populations, and contrary to the sort of sky is falling, the industry is going to go out of business. The industry adapts. The lobster industry has been incredibly successful over the last 10 years. Lobster revenues New England wide over the last 10 years have gone up and up and up. New England has some of the most successful fisheries in the United States. Certainly the scallop fishery out of New Bedford is one of the most profitable. In Canada, we have thriving lobster industry off Nova Scotia, off of the Gulf of St. Lawrence. There's a crab fishery that's incredibly successful. So when you see scientists and conservationists, fishermen, gear manufacturers, and the government coming together for solutions, I think that's really the future. And that isn't just to solve a problem of the right whale. Entanglement, for that matter, is a larger problem than simply that of the right whale. Lots of species suffer entanglement, lots of mammal species, turtles, and others. And it's not just in New England, it's not just in Atlantic Canada, it's really everywhere where you have fixed gear fisheries and you have trap and pot fisheries. And I think that the future really lies in people working together, people coming up with solutions, and then going to our elected officials, to our elected bodies, whether it's Parliament in Canada or whether it's Congress in the United States, and going together and saying, look, we have a solution that we think could work for these species and for our communities and for our businesses. We need some support from our governments, from our taxpayers, and we need to be able to move forward together. And there's some examples of that right here in New England. For instance, the ground fishery was required to carry vessel monitoring systems a few years back. These are systems that let the federal government see where boats are fishing for enforcement and for monitoring. Fishermen had to go out and buy these systems. They cost about $5,000 each, but then the federal government paid them back that $5,000. So there, at the end of the day, there was no long-term out-of-pocket expense. Last time the federal government changed lobster gear and we went from floating ground line to sinking ground line, the International Fund for Animal Welfare and Congress worked together to create a fund to buy back the old floating rope so the fishermen could use the buyback money to pay for the new sinking rope so that it wasn't a net loss for the fishermen. That's a model that I think has a lot of opportunity and we should be looking towards. The other model is what we did with the groundfish fishery, which was for years and years, scientists and conservationists said the cod fishery in New England is going to collapse, just like it did up in Newfoundland, and we need to take measures now. But we can never come together, we can never make those measures work, and the cod fishery collapsed. And then the US federal government spent more than 200 million taxpayer dollars bailing out the groundfish industry for disaster relief. So from my point of view, it makes a lot more sense for us to get out ahead of the problem, to bring people together, to create a comprehensive way to move forward that the public can get behind and pay the cost up front to fix the fishery, not let the fishery go into collapse and then bail it out with taxpayer dollars. And I really think that's the way forward.
Steve, if I can just connect a couple of these comments really quickly, because I agree with everything that Peter just said. Again, one of the things we're learning about the cod fishery, as David detailed earlier, is it's not just that it sort of collapsed from overfishing, but that it's moved, right? And because we didn't have the good science to really understand that, we led to a situation where we had to bail out a whole bunch of fishermen. If we had been able to anticipate that, we might have been able to say, hey, we need to start fishing other species, or you literally need to move your families, but the cod just aren't here anymore. And so I think that to go back to the question about what are the lessons that can be learned for other controversial things like offshore wind, the point I just want to emphasize once again is we've got to stick close to the science. I perhaps should have explained that I actually have a degree in physics, which makes me an anomaly in the United States Congress, not just because I have a degree in science, but because I actually believe in it. And that's an important perspective for us to bring to the table. But, I'm sometimes reminded that my friends in the conservation community and whatnot sometimes are guilty of believing in the science when it agrees with their political beliefs. And we've got to be careful of that as well. When you talk about wind, for example, I'm reminded that more people die from wind turbines than have ever died from nuclear power. And nuclear power is our single biggest source of carbon-free energy. But I say that to challenge perhaps some of the people listening who may be opposed to nuclear power, even though there's no scientific or statistical basis to really fear it. Are there possibilities that could be disastrous? Yes, but if you actually look at this scientifically and statistically, it's a much safer form of energy production, and it's far better for the environment.
Congressman, how have people died from wind power? Is that just in construction?
Primarily from falls, for maintaining the turbines. We have a few wind turbines in Gloucester, actually just 3. And I don't know if I've ever seen all 3 working at the same time. So they break a lot and people have to go up and fix them, and they're very high up and people die. I mean, there's real human deaths here. So I just throw that out there to challenge people that believing in science isn't something that everyone does all the time. Sometimes we like to think that this is just a problem with conservatives or Republicans or whatnot, to put this in political terms. But we've got to make sure we're doing that as well when we look at all these different things and the impacts that they can have. So when it comes to something like offshore wind, let's really look carefully at what the impacts are. And sometimes the science tells us things that we don't necessarily expect, but ultimately that's what should guide our policy.
Okay, thank you. One more question. This is a very specific one, so maybe Dr. Brown, I think you could answer this one. Has there been a major change in ship propellers as a major cause of death for right whales over the last few decades? Cause or a factor?
Not so much a change in propellers. So there's a couple of different ways that a whale can, in all likelihood, intersect with a vessel. You can have blunt trauma where the whale perhaps hits the hull or the bow, and then you can have sharp trauma that's the result of direct contact with a propeller. But no, we haven't seen big changes in propellers, and so the reason being is from all of the work that we looked at, it seemed the best solution was to actually not have whales and ships in the same place. And so there have been areas in both Canada and the US where shipping lanes have been moved around whale feeding aggregations or around calving areas. Recommended routes have been put in place to concentrate the traffic away from where the whales appear to aggregate. And in the US and in Canada now, in the case where there's an intersection point between whales and ships, there's no room to go around, the vessels are slowing down to 10 knots or less. Now that does not eliminate the risk of a lethal vessel collision, but it does reduce it to about 30%. Whereas, for example, a speed of 20 knots, if the probability shows there's a 100% chance of killing a whale if a vessel strikes it at that speed. So we've done more to change operations, and I will add that in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there are dynamic measures in place where vessels are slowed down in shipping lanes all spring, summer, and fall, and the compliance rate, it is monitored by Transport Canada. There are fines issued, and their compliance rate's about 99%. So the shipping industry, and it's both domestic and international ships going through there. So it is actually worth taking a moment and applauding members of the shipping industry and fishing industry who are making changes to their method of operation to work towards coexistence.
Dr. Brown, can I ask you, is there a sense in which some of these restrictions put in some time ago need to be adjusted because of climate change, or is there a system in place for evolving them as whale populations shift and feeding grounds and breeding grounds may move?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we still have some right whales coming to the Bay of Fundy and south of Nova Scotia, but just not very many. So those areas are designated as critical habitats, and that has not changed. The Gulf of St. Lawrence area, the protection measures are adapted every year as we learn more about right whales, because the whales are new to that area, researchers are new to that area as well. And so in years when there have been high mortalities, there's actually been measures, protective measures put in place right in the middle of the season. So they are taking very much an adaptive, dynamic approach to the Gulf of St. Lawrence situation. Again, it's only about 5 years old. And so we've had to act really quickly and dramatically with those. Some of the other measures that have been put in place in the US have been in place now for over 10 years. And I know there are efforts underway to try and adapt some of those measures a little bit as seasons have changed for the whales movements, migrations and aggregations. For example, in Cape Cod Bay, when I first started working there in '97, we maybe saw 50 right whales a winter. And now there's many years, there's over 300, and it's been like that for 10 years. So that's a hugely important area for right whales. And there are some measures related to fishing and shipping that probably need to be adapted around that area due to the high concentration of animals there in the spring.
And just to connect a few of the dots from what the Congressman and Mo were talking about, if for anyone who hasn't actually seen the film, the movement that we're talking about and the impact of climate change involves a decline of some 90% in the primary food source for right whales, this rice-sized creature called a type of plankton called Calanus finmarchicus. And in the summer, there were these huge blooms of these of this plankton right off of the coast of where Mo lives and works. And that area is called the Bay of Fundy. But that population has declined dramatically in recent years. And as a result of that decline, which most scientists have attributed to the warming of those waters, the whales had to look for other feeding grounds. And as a result of that, many of the whales moved further north into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where before 2017, they were never seen in any significant numbers. And in 2017, we lost 17 right whales, 12 of them in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And the primary explanation for that loss is that they just didn't have any regulations, and they didn't have any reason to expect that there would be that number of whales so far north in places they hadn't seen before. And so climate change, as the Congressman mentioned earlier, is scrambling this problem by making it harder to figure out where to put closures, where to have ship speed regulations, and so forth.
Have the things like dynamic closures, like Dr. Brown mentioned, have these types of things been tried before in off the coast of New England?
Nearly every fishery in New England has some sort of closures, whether it's seasonal or time area. In the lobster fishery, there is a closure in Cape Cod Bay, which is part of Massachusetts Bay, to protect right whales specifically. I'm not sure, is that answering your question? There, the groundfish fishery has large closed areas, both inshore and offshore. The herring fishery has spawning closures. Most fisheries have some areas that are closed either to protect habitat or spawning aggregations, or in the case of overfished stocks, to protect what they call mortality closures, to limit how much of the stock can be caught. So closures are certainly a widespread, very heavily used management measure in New England, in Canada, and really throughout the world. It's a primary management tool. Quota-based management, seasonal time area closures are certainly nothing new to the fishing industry here or anywhere else.
Peter's right, and he knows this better than I do. He's certainly been doing it for a lot longer. I would just add that the challenge with dynamic closures can be that the fishermen, of course, if they're dynamic, they can't anticipate them coming, and so they tend to be more controversial. And so they're necessary as everything gets scrambled. But every time one of them comes down the pipe, there's an uproar, shall we say, from the community, because people feel like, okay, this is just totally catching us by surprise. At least, the regular closures are something that we're used to, and that's one of the reasons that it can all be more challenging.
And dynamic.
Peter?
I think with any management measure, whether it's closures or gear changes, the devil's in the details, right? So figuring out how quickly you can close an area, like in Canada, their regulations allow them, as Mo was explaining earlier, when right whales are present, to close areas quickly within 48 hours to get gear out of fairly large areas. Our federal government hasn't felt that they have the authority to do that because of some of the public notice laws that they have. But ultimately, whether you're trying to figure out how large of an area to close, where to close, when to close it, those are all things that need to be data driven, like the congressman was talking about, that are dependent on having good science and good observation. But all of that, and this whole conversation we're having about right whales, I think there's two key factors that we need to keep thinking about, and those are the time frame and the consequences. Right, we're talking about a major mammal species, this iconic thousands-of-year-old species of whale that lives off the coast of the wealthiest continent on the history of the world, and it may go extinct in our lifetime. Those are huge. The stakes are extremely high. The time frame is extremely compressed. So we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We need to take action. And rather than waiting for a gear revolution where 5,000 lobstermen in New England and however many thousands of lobstermen and crab fishermen in Canada change all their gear over, right? So there's 5,000 lobstermen in New England. They each have about 800 traps. That's millions of traps. Changing all their gear over is an evolution, not a revolution, certainly. So it's going to take time. What we can do in the short term is we can identify areas where we know whales congregate, where we can predict that they're likely to be, and create targeted seasonal area closures that we think can protect the most whales with the impact on the least amount of lobstermen and crab fishermen, to balance it out, while a longer process of figuring out a way to harmonize the fishery with the population of right whales takes place. So from my point of view, in the short term, we create closures with the best available data that we have, and that buys us some time to figure out the longer evolution of how we create a fishery that can be compatible with the long-term health and sustainability of right whales, so that they don't go extinct on our watch in our lifetime.
Okay, David, I'll let you follow up there. I just the congressman is going to have to leave here very soon, and we want to thank him for appearing in this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for having me. It's such an important discussion, and we're going to keep working on this. The piece of legislation that my team and I have worked on for several years right now has passed both the House and the Senate. We're waiting for it to be favorably reported for their vote. It's passed committees. And so we've got more work to do. And the advocacy of everybody who's listening to this is really important. And so I want to thank you all for joining me today. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to participate. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, David.
I was going to actually ask the congressman a question, but I put it to Peter and Mo actually about the regulatory process in the United States, and also how it compares to how it works in Canada. I mean, the ultimate question is this: we have this very complicated and slow-moving regulatory structure as a result of the Marine Mammal Protection Act here in the United States. And I wonder what you guys think, in terms, and I was going to ask this to the congressman, what he thinks in terms of maybe updating the legislation or how this should change to accelerate or speed up this process. So it seemed, and I thought we had the end of our film early on when we started shooting this film, when the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team, known by everyone as the TRT, came up with what seemed like this historic, nearly unanimous solution, unanimously approved solution, and that was to drastically reduce the number of lobster lines in the Gulf of Maine. And it seemed to have broad support through this incredibly democratic process, which involved fishermen and scientists and state and federal regulators. And then, of course, there was an immediate backlash and there was all kinds of conflict. And now, a year and a half later, there are no rules. And we're still waiting for draft rules, but it seems, but they're caught in this black hole in this office in the White House called the Office of Management and Budget, which has been sitting on these rules. We don't know when they're going to be released, and we don't know, ultimately what they're going to actually do. And so my question for you guys is, what do you think needs to happen in this country to change the way we regulate and make decisions? And maybe Mo can compare it to how it works in Canada, where basically a minister comes, has a solution and can, with a swipe of a pen, effectively put it in effect on the water, in hours if need be.
Yeah, I mean, that did happen in 2017 when there was such a high number of right whales killed as a result of vessel strikes and gear entanglements, and measures were put in place within a couple of weeks. And there were some people complaining that didn't happen fast enough. So yeah, it's kind of like light speed compared to the US. I would like to add those, just so the listeners can put this in context. So there's been a lot of discussion about how many pots an individual fisherman can put in the water. And in New England, it is, for example, for lobster, it's 800. To put that in perspective, in the Bay of Fundy, for example, the lobster season just started, and each fisherman only puts 300 pots in the water, each boat. If they have a double license, then that's 425. So and they're doing well with that. Their catches are good. They're making a good living with that. Up in the snow crab fishery, they have I think 125 or 150 pots. So it's we have a lot fewer vertical lines in the water than just across the border in New England. So that's a good thing. Trawling up is something that the lobstermen already do in the Bay of Fundy, anywhere from 10, 20, sometimes 30 pots on a trawl. Well, if you only have 300 pots, you have 10 trawls. But the regulatory side is not perfect in Canada either. For example, one of the fishing associations, the one on Graham and Ann in the mouth of the Bay of Fundy, offered to eliminate one of their end lines on their trawls. But it's actually in the regulations in the Canadian Fisheries Act that trawls are required to have 2 end lines. And that process is still underway and has been underway for about 4 or 5 years to try and change that within the Canadian Fisheries Act. So I don't want to give the impression that everything happens fast in Canada, but certainly some on the ground changes did happen very fast.
All right. Thank you all. I want to thank David and Andy for this this really timely and important film. I think the really important thing about it is it brings people together to talk about this issue, keeps conversations going. I would urge people who've seen the film to share it with their friends and their colleagues and discuss this issue, this urgent and timely issue, as you've heard everyone talk about here today. And we're just very thankful to have had David and the Representative Moulton, Dr. Brown, and Peter Baker here for today's conversation. I thank you all very much. And I want to thank our audience and for all your good questions. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Kayla Edwards, our producer for this session. And I'd like to thank the entire team of the Environmental Film Festival and the nation's capital for making this event possible. We really value our partnership. It's been going on for 10 years. We hope to keep it going for a long time. We also want to thank the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education for supporting our Connected Coastlines reporting and events like this one. And you can find more on the Pulitzer Center and our reporting projects, including all of the Connected Coastlines stories on our Pulitzer Center website. Please join us for future events, including an upcoming event on December 2nd, covering environmental crises through innovation and collaboration during the Journalism Under Fire annual conference. We really appreciate you joining us for today's session. And for those of you who are able, please remember we're a nonprofit organization, so we depend on donor support. And if you would hang on after the session, there'll be a survey that we really appreciate if you'd fill that out and let us know how you felt about this. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much. Wonderful
Excellent.
film. Thank you.
Terrific.
All right. Bye for now.